Was AMD dishonest about socket AM4's upgrade path? Let's talk about it.
Geek Therapy Radio.
I think a good place to start is the fact that socket is not the same thing as chipset. For instance, the upgrade to PCI Express 4.0 from 3.0 is a chipset upgrade, not socket. Socket is like an engine bay in a car. The same car may introduce a model that upgrades the original 4-cylinder to an 8-cylinder, but you'll need to upgrade other things like brakes and suspension to accommodate the increase in horsepower and weight. So, the third generation Ryzen is still the same AM4 socket, but PCI Express 4.0 requires an upgraded chipset, in this case X570 and B550. Now, I know what you're thinking, but I'm not going to go into detail about PCIe Express 4.0 support on X470 and B450 because it's a chaotic, confusing quagmire of per motherboard BIOS and compatibility issues. AMD does not officially support PCI Express 4.0 on B450 or X470, and thus AMD can't guarantee it. One of AMD's biggest concerns being that the actual electrical traces on these boards are not standardized to the PCI Express 4.0 specifications. But anyways, getting back on track. The contention and confusion among some current and future AMD customers is that budget boards and older prosumer boards won't be compatible with some higher-end 3000 series Zen 2 processors and completely locked out from 4000 series Zen 3 around the corner. Perfectly valid concerns. For instance, one of the most popular AM4 motherboard chipsets right now is, of course, B450. Anyone with the popular B450 chipset will be locked out of the upcoming 4000 series Zen 3 processors. In other words, if you have a B450 and you're waiting to upgrade to a Zen 3 processor, you will be required to upgrade your motherboard as well to either X570 or the new B550 coming out in June. This is where the anger and confusion comes from. Some B450 owners, in this example, are angry that they'll be forced to upgrade their motherboard if they want a Zen 3 CPU. That anger is born out of confusion over AMD's promise to support socket AM4 at least through 2020. But again, socket is not chipset. Chipsets usually update several times over the life of the socket as the processors naturally advance and add more features like PCI Express 4.0 and at some point DDR5 RAM. Since I still mess around with an old Cool 2 Quad Q6600, I vividly remember Intel's Socket 775 transition through chipsets as RAM advanced from DDR2 to DDR3 within the same socket cycle. DDR3 was faster and the newest CPUs could take advantage of the new features. So the chipset, even though it was on the same socket, had to advance. Now this brings me to my next point. In my personal opinion, it would make absolutely zero sense to upgrade to Zen 3 on an older board that can't utilize Zen 3's improvements anyways. For instance, lots of B450 motherboards don't even have the option of updating the BIOS to unofficially support PCI Express 4.0. So why buy the latest and greatest Zen 3 processor only to have PCIe Express capped at 3.0 along with bottlenecking other Zen 3 features? The upgrade path makes no sense, and if your goal is upgrading to an HEDT high-end desktop processor, you'll want a prosumer board like an X570 anyway from the beginning. Now listen, this is just my opinion, and this argument can go around and round, and each opinion, of course, is as valid as the next. Before I move on to my personal recommendations to anyone thinking of building a new AMD PC in early 2020, I'll summarize my thoughts on whether or not AMD has actually lied to or deceived its customers. In my opinion, again, just my opinion, I do not think that AMD is doing anything malicious or greedy. I personally think that the backlash and anger is born out of confusion, recalling that AMD promised to support the AM4 socket through 2020. Many people confuse this to believe that that meant every AMD processor would be compatible with every AM4 chipset, which is not the case and was never promised. Also, in my opinion, this is a case of AMD absolutely crushing it for so long that any pivot to utilize ever more revolutionary architecture is perceived as AMD giving in to greed or corruption. It's not malicious. It's literally just that Zen 3 is going to be so freaking advanced that only the latest platforms will be able to support the new features. It's not a slap in the face, it's the splash of cold water that often accompanies progress. If you want the most powerful advanced processors on Earth, it requires a platform to support them. So in other words, if you want a bigger engine in that car, you're going to have to upgrade the drivetrain and suspension to support the increase in power. So where does that leave current AMD customers and potential customers? We'll start with current customers. One of the biggest caveats of the new B550 consumer boards is that 1000 series CPUs, 2000 series CPUs and APUs, and 3000 series APUs will not work with B550. To simplify that statement, odds are you cannot put your Ryzen 1700 or 2700X in a B550 while you wait for Zen 3. If you're on a B450, your path ends at the 3000 series. Now, I know for enthusiasts, it's almost impossible to be honest with ourselves. But odds are that a B450 with a 16-core, 32-thread Ryzen 9 3950X will be overkill for years to come, even still on B450. So if you're still on a B450 with a middle-of-the-road Ryzen 5 3600, not only are you more than okay for the next few years, you still have an upgrade path, especially when that 3950X hits the used market for pennies on the dollar when their owners have moved on to Zen 3. At the end of the day, B450 owners are still set for the next 5 to possibly 10 years. Easy. And by that time, you'll be able to upgrade to the next big thing that will surely be coming down the pipe. Zen 4, Zen 5, whatever. B450 will last that long. It'll get you by that long. And I know get you by is a phrase we hate. We hate as PC enthusiasts. So as for new potential AMD customers, there are two groups of you for the most part. The hardcore enthusiast looking to invest in the current best, and then there are the more budget conscious. Now, if you're a hardcore enthusiast, you're likely not even bothering to browse B450, X470, or even B550. If you're hardcore, you're looking at X570 right now, and that's really it. I know this for a fact because I just ordered an X570 myself, and they are on back order until late May and impossible to find in brick and mortar stores. You've already scooped them up to be as current and as future-proof as possible. The proof is in the pudding. Now, for the budget conscious that don't necessarily need nor care about Zen 3 right now, but want to keep the upgrade path open, I'd strongly recommend staying away from a new B450 build. Wait until June, about a month from this podcast, to get into a B550. Now, if you have to build today and you're browsing Amazon while you're listening to this podcast, you'd still have to wait for an X570 on back order for a couple weeks anyways. So again, if it's a future-proof budget build you're after, wait for the B550. Now, all of that said, despite all of the controversy and misunderstanding and confusion and anger, B450 will still be relevant and more than capable for the next 5 to 10 years. Easy. Yes, 5 to 10 years. The top-of-the-line processor for the B450, even if it just stays the 3950X at 16 cores and 32 threads, that's 16 cores and 32 threads. that's gonna get you by for years to come, even on B450. So that pretty much wraps up my thoughts. Did AMD lie to us? No. Did we misunderstand them? Yes. I think a lot of people have misunderstood AMD when they said that they would support AM4 through at least 2020. They will continue to support the AM4 socket. That doesn't mean that processors can come out for the AM4 socket that don't require a better, improved chipset. Could AMD have been more clear about that? Perhaps. Have they done anything wrong necessarily? Not really. Again, I go back to the thought that AMD has just been crushing it for so long that any sort of pivot can be construed as something to elicit anger and confusion. If you're not an enthusiast and doesn't need to upgrade to the best of the best every cycle, you're going to be fine for years on the B450. Well, that's all I got for now. Thank you so much for listening to the Geek Therapy Radio podcast. Let me know your thoughts on this. Of course, you can always email me, geektherapy@iheartmedia.com, or on Facebook, Geek Therapy Radio on Facebook. Just throw a post to me on there. Also on Instagram, Geek Therapy Radio on Instagram, and Twitter. Twitter's a great place to @ me. Geek Therapy Radio on Twitter. Just search for it. It's there. Geek Therapy Radio on YouTube. Any way you want to let me know, those are all the avenues to let me know. Thank you so much for listening. Know that you are worthy of love, both giving and receiving love, and you are worthy of your own self-confidence. Thank you so much for listening. I'll talk to you guys later.